since probably October of last year, and we're finally up to what's going on in Israel right now with the Hamas-Israeli war that started on October 7th. And some of the big points are, World War I we went through was the operation that freed up the land from the Ottoman Empire after 400 years exactly from 1517 to 1917. They got the land back. World War II accomplished what for God? It brought the Jews back. World War III, will God hopefully bring the Lord back? We've looked at the Independence War of 1948. We looked at the Suez Canal 1956 war as a preemptive learning tutorial for the Six-Day War in 1967, because it almost happened the exact same way. And then the significance of the Yom Kippur War really came out to us because it's 50 years, almost to the month and day, of when it happened in 1973. So we're seeing these like bookends coming up. And then we also saw what happens when you do a land for peace deal, according to Leviticus 25:23. Yes, Jacob.
Whoever's in control of whichever nation that is being done usually ends up losing something, either their health or, I think, was it Kennedy's administration we lost this Panama Canal? Was it Kennedy?
It was 1956, it was Eisenhower, and he didn't know anything about it, but the Panama Canal was actually the British, under British control, and Anthony Eden was their prime minister. And it was his one time after Churchill to show himself ready, and he wasn't. It was a big fat mess. He secretly worked with the Israelis to try to get them to attack the Egyptians so the French forces and English could come in and take it. The UN didn't approve it. The United States didn't know about it.
I thought the Panama Canal, though, was...
Oh, the Panama. Yes. Yeah, sorry. That was lost, thank you very much, in the 1978 and 79 Camp David Accords. And so Carter went home bankrupt. He lost the election. They lost the Panama Canal. That was the Love Canal controversy also, and spiraling inflation that was out of control, and gas prices were ridiculous. So yeah, all that happened under that. Sadat was assassinated from Egypt, and Menachem Begin went into Great Depression. His wife died, end of career. So the same thing happened again when Sharon did what in 2005? And this event set the stage for what happened here in Gaza. I'm sorry? Well, what they did was they pulled the Jews and the Jewish settlements out of Gaza, demolished their homes, demolished everything the Jews had built, and gave it to the Palestinians. What happened as a buildup after that?
Millions of dollars flew into that area.
Right.
And instead of building infrastructure, which would have made it potentially the Shanghai of the Middle East, it ends up becoming the most war-pestered place in the entire Middle East, with Hamas now using all that funds to build massive miles and miles of tunnels.
Yep, it's 2.5 to 3 million people. All the humanitarian aid that was going there went into building 450 miles of tunnels, and it went into not building hospitals and schools for the Palestinians, but instead building the underground tools, using their children and the elderly as a shield for Hamas itself. It's sickening, and it's like nobody will tell the truth. And it's very, very hard. So this video that we started last week but didn't finish basically told us why nobody wants the Palestinians in any neighboring country. Let's cover Egypt. What did they say about Egypt? Financially, it's on the brink of disaster. They can't take any humanitarian aid. It's just overwhelming to them. And it would upset the kingdom because right now they can barely control the terrorist elements that they got going on in the Sinai. If they were to take the Palestinians and put them in the Sinai, the whole thing would just explode. So they're like, no, we can't do it. Then we covered Jordan. Why did Jordan say, absolutely do not let any of them in to our country? the Hashemite dynasty is in the minority. I mean, way in the minority. If the Palestinians come in, Jordan is already considered a refugee state. Like 2/3 of the population are refugees from Sudan and other countries. So they financially couldn't handle it, and there's many other reasons. So I want to finish this because the next element that we didn't get to was Iran, so hopefully it will play for me and I'll move it along. Get down to, I was talking about Egypt. Do you want a review of that? Are you good? Okay.
The Sea of the West Bank have more than doubled since Hamas's attack on Israel that came on October 7th. While 2023 is looking like it will end as one of the bloodiest years on record for Palestinians within the West Bank. The hardline Israeli settlers in the West Bank who want to annex parts or all of Area C directly into Israel likely realize that their window of opportunity could be closing in the near future. As the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza continues, the Israeli government will almost certainly face increasing pressures from abroad to restart a new diplomatic process with the Palestinians on the two-state solution. And the Palestinians and much of the rest of the world will want the Palestinian state to include the entirety of the West Bank, including Area C, where 480,000 Israeli settlers currently live. Most of the plans that are being discussed right now concerning the future of the Gaza Strip after Israel dismantles Hamas's government there involve giving control of the post-war Gaza Strip back to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian government that currently...
That changed very recently. There was a huge convention in Israel where 15 members of their Knesset and other government ministers all showed up and said, what should happen to Gaza after we root out Hamas? Any guesses as to what they said? It was all over the news for a little while. We should remake it as a Jewish land and put the Jews back in that were taken out in 2005, which I forgot to bring up. What happened to Ariel Sharon after that deal, after he pulled the Jews out of Gaza in 2005? He had a stroke, didn't talk again for a decade, and died. Leviticus 25:23, over and over and over again. It's my land. You don't get to sell it to anybody else. If you do, here's what will happen. It's very strong. So now that 2005 extrication of Jews out of Gaza caused the buildup of Hamas to build 450 miles of tunnels to buy all of these supplies and be given supplies by Iran, by Syria and other countries, and to store them underground. And it wasn't just October 7th that this all happened. They've been sending rockets over Israel daily. That's why we had supported the United States Iron Dome, to give them the ability to shoot these things down as they're coming around, and David Slingshot, which is another military program. So I just want to point out that now Israel's looking at Gaza and saying, we should resettle this land as Jewish and find some other solution for the Palestinians, but nobody wants them.
Only controls the enclaves of areas A and B in the West Bank, and the government led by the 88-year-old Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah party that lost control over the Gaza Strip back in 2007 after Hamas ejected them. However, in exchange for accepting the return control and responsibility over the Gaza Strip following the war, it is expected that Abbas and the Palestinian Authority are likely to demand that they will also need ironclad assurances from the United States for a clear and final path towards an independent Palestinian state based on the entirety of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and probably East Jerusalem as well. And if Washington agrees, that implies that the roughly 700,000 Israeli settlers who live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem together would have to be mass evacuated into Israel proper. And thus, with a large amount of the Israeli military now moved out of the West Bank to focus on all the other fronts, the Israeli settlers and militias in Area C are sensing that in order to keep their colonies within Israel in the future, they...
So the threat is, if this two-state solution is forced on them, which we saw was an example of it from 2005 till today, Hamas can't rule itself. The Palestinians cannot rule themselves. And if this happens, it'll be ground zero for the whole West Bank to become a terrorist space for other organizations like Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, who knows who else, to get in there. And like they said, they've got over 700,000, almost 1 million Jews living there now. So it really is a problem, and once again, it makes Israel indefensible. What happens at that little isthmus of land. It's only 8 miles wide. Up here in the top, I don't know if this laser works or not. Is the laser? Is the laser? Okay. Is it on the side?
Right now you're off.
No.
Yes, this guy right here.
Oh, thanks. Okay, it makes it indefensible. You've only got like 5 miles here. How far did the Hamas push into Israel on October 7th? 15 miles. They went in. This is not even 8 miles right here. So it would literally push them into the sea. And that's basically what's happening to Hamas right now, is they're being pushed into the sea because Egypt will not open the border down here. So I just wanted to bring that up. That's what makes it indefensible. And that whole Samaria region is the high ground. So when you're in a military space, you're low and you're trying to defend yourself against munitions that are high up. Who's got the advantage? The people who are in the high ground.
Must act now before a ceasefire or peace agreement is made that might surrender Area C for good. From their perspective, perhaps, by forcibly pushing as many Palestinians as they can from Area C into the enclaves of Areas A and B or into neighboring Jordan. And if the violence in the West Bank between the settlers and the Palestinians continues to escalate amidst the ongoing war in Gaza, it might eventually become enough to trigger a third intifada or uprising from among the 3 million Palestinians who live across the entire West Bank. An uprising that would likely involve attacks on Israeli settlements in Area C and attacks across the West Bank into Israel proper. A full-blown Palestinian insurgency exploding in the West Bank like this before the war in Gaza is even finished would likely force the Israelis to redeploy some of their forces away from Gaza and back towards the West Bank to suppress it. Because if the uprising got more radical, it would trigger one of Israel's greatest geographic fears. Ever since Israel's founding in 1948, the country has been very wary of any hostile power acquiring control over the West Bank, because it includes a series of highly elevated hills that overlook Israel's lower elevation and narrow coastal plain. While Israel's self-declared capital and most well-known city is Jerusalem, Israel's actual civilizational core is located here across the narrow and low coastal plain between the Mediterranean Sea and the hills of the West Bank. This narrow coastal plain includes the Tel Aviv metropolitan area right here, which is a region that is also known in Hebrew as Gush Dan. Gush Dan is home to more than 4,150,000 people today, which is about 44% of the entire Israeli population all on its own. Gush Dan further represents roughly half of the entire Israeli economy. And so, despite Jerusalem being the country's political and religious capital, Tel Aviv is the country's economic, commercial, cultural, and industrial core. And tragically, for the fates of millions of people throughout history, Israel's narrowest geographic point is also just to the north of the Gush Dan region here, in between the West Bank and the Mediterranean Sea. This gap is less than 9 miles wide. And so, if the West Bank was fully under the control of an organization that was hostile to Israel, such as Hamas, it would only take an advance of about 9 miles for an invasion force to completely sever Israel into 2 separate geographic halves. And for reference, during the October 7th attack, Hamas was able to punch into Israel nearly 14 miles deep at their furthest advance. Had the same thing happened out of the West Bank, Israel could have been split into 2, while militants could have been attacking the downtown core of Tel Aviv itself. And so, in order to increase their strategic depth further away from the coastal plain, and in order to deny an enemy the use of the high ground immediately facing the coastal plain, Israel has long considered their continued control, or at least influence over the West Bank, to be a geographically vital strategy to maintain, even if the rest of the outside world considers it to be illegal and condemns them for it, which is Israel's strategic rationale for having allowed hundreds of thousands of settlers to live in the West Bank, and why Israel would immediately respond to a large-scale Palestinian insurgency erupting in the West Bank that could potentially catapult a new, more hostile government into areas A and B there. Such an event taking place would also be a terrifying prospect for the neighboring Hashemite kingdom of Jordan to witness as well. Because of previous history, Jordan is already the home of the largest number of Palestinian refugees and their descendants anywhere in the world, nearly 2.2 million of them. These Palestinian refugees already make up about 20% of the kingdom's entire population. And they aren't even the only refugees present here either. Jordan is also home to nearly 800,000 more refugees from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Sudan, bringing the total number of refugees present within the country today to around 3 million, out of a total population of only 11.4 million. This means that Jordan already has the second highest number of refugees per capita of any country in the world. And that means they are looking at the situation in the neighboring West Bank and the Gaza Strip with a very high degree of alarm.
Yep, so Jordan's always kind of been on the fence, but more towards the Arab states than it has been towards Israel, although there's been several attempts by Israel to make that happen. What is that area today back in time? If we were to go back and look at it, look at your maps at the end, back of your Bibles, or look at Psalms 83, where it talks about the Hagarites, it talks about Edom, it talks about Ammon, Moab, all those different places. Where were those locations today? They were in modern day Jordan and parts of Saudi Arabia, but they were just to the west of here. So if you look at your Bibles at the very back, you'll see Edom, Moab, Ammon on the other side of the Jordan. So these prophecies against those lands, because of their hatred of the Jews, we looked at Obadiah last week, the whole chapter. Now what I'd like to do is to confirm this, is to go to Ezekiel chapter 25, and it's just a few short verses. It's verse 12 through 14, just two verses. If I could get a reader, Jacob. Yep. It starts at verse 12, but it's chapter 25. But do reread Obadiah, because that is, we're waiting for that one to be fulfilled as well. Or I can read it.
What verses did you want again, Joe?
12 through 14.
Thus saith the Lord God, because that Edom hath dealt against the house of Judah by taking vengeance, and hath greatly offended, and revenged himself upon them, therefore thus saith the Lord God, I will also stretch out mine hand upon Edom, and will cut off man and beast from it. And I will make it desolate from Teman, and they of Dedan shall fall by the sword. And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel. And they shall do in Edom according to mine anger, and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, saith the Lord God.
Okay, so Obadiah tells us they're not going to be a people anymore. They're going to be completely wiped out. This mentions Teman and Dedan, which is down in this area, but Dedan is actually, I think most people consider it Saudi Arabia. And they do. They've hated the Jews for a very long time. So when you put these two together, you realize why God has this indictment against them, because they have hated his people, and they have divided his land, and they have also persecuted the Jews in every way possible and laughed at all their calamities all throughout history, including the Babylonian captivity. So Jordan is this area. They were obliterated, obviously, during the 6-Day War. They loaned their whole army and air force to Egypt. Egypt mismanaged it. It was all lost. So the Hazemite dynasty is always holding on by their fingernails, because it's a refugee state, and they're holding on to power very lightly.
As Israel has already ordered more than 1 million Palestinians to evacuate from the northern Gaza Strip, and speculation runs rampant about more potentially being evacuated into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Jordan's principal fear right now is that if the situation worsens...
I forgot to mention that one part. Egypt, the United States, UK, and several other countries are entering into a deal with them saying, what? Look, we know you got problems. If you take these refugees in, we'll wipe out your debt. Okay? So there's a lot of politics going on behind the scenes, but Jordan is in pretty much the same boat.
In the West Bank as well, up to 3 million of the Palestinians who live there might be pushed out into Jordan. And if that happens, the country would shatter. With so many refugees already present in the country, a sudden large influx of even more would strain Jordan's resources to the breaking point, which would be a similarly terrifying prospect to Saudi Arabia as well, since dramatically increased instability in Jordan, from millions of Palestinian refugees fleeing or being pushed into both of them, would directly threaten one of the Saudi kingdom's most ambitious mega projects going on right nearby, NEO, the $500 billion futuristic linear city that they are building immediately adjacent to Jordan and the Sinai Peninsula. Jordan and Saudi Arabia have therefore each made it extremely clear that any expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan will be a very firm red line for Israel not to cross, that could even jeopardize the previously agreed upon peace treaties between Israel and Egypt and Jordan. And then, looming all around Israel, circling like sharks sniffing for blood, are Iran and their allied proxy forces that they call the Axis of Resistance, consisting of the king, Iran itself, their Rook, the Houthis in control of northwestern Yemen, their Knights, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, their bishop, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, their queen, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and their various pawns, the many Palestinian militant groups operating within the Gaza Strip, all of whom cooperate together with Iran in pursuit of a common ultimate objective.
I love this. I'm like, chess is fun. This is amazing. He's actually identified who's the rook, who's the queen, the king, the pawns in this whole Middle Eastern game of chess, which is what most theologians have called it. It's a giant chess match, and they're all got a part to play. Why is the queen important in chess? Exactly, to move anywhere and operate in any sphere. The king is the one trying to pull the punches all the way along, but that's why they're basically considering Hezbollah the queen, because Hezbollah can move wherever they tell it to and strike wherever they tell it to. So it makes a lot of sense why he's used chess pieces as an analogy for what's going on in the Middle East.
The complete annihilation of Israel as a state. Of all the pieces on the board that are in this axis of resistance, it is Iran's Rook, the Houthis, who are the ones that are the most geographically far removed from the current fight going on between Israel and Hamas. Their territory is about 1,600 kilometers away from Israel's, and separated by the entirety of Saudi Arabia and nearly the entire length of the Red Sea. But nonetheless, distance has not dissuaded the Houthis from attempting to join in the fight anyway, and they're already using their geographic advantages to harm Israel in other ways. Armed with advanced long-range cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and suicide drones supplied from the Iranians, the Houthis possess substantially more capable weapons than Hamas does, with the ranges required to attack Israel itself. And so, they've been frequently using them ever since Israel began its invasion of the Gaza Strip to target Israel's southernmost city, Eilat, which is also Israel's only maritime port beyond the Mediterranean that's on the Red Sea.
Okay, so that is the only port in Israel that goes out to the Indian Ocean and through the Red Sea. Now let's talk about where are these Houthis? Where do they live? What country? In Yemen. So do you all remember the USS Cole that blew up or had a huge hole put in it? That was done by them. That was like almost 25, 30 years ago now. So it's been a proxy war state between two countries in Yemen. Who is the two proxy war going on with? The Houthis are supported by Iran. Very good. The other side is supported by Saudi Arabia. Both of them have been pumping money, materials, training, whatever, to everybody in Yemen, and to keep this fight going, because Saudi Arabia hates Iran, and so does Iran hate Saudi Arabia. So they're just constantly keeping this boiling pot in Yemen all the time. Now the Houthis are striking out on every ship that comes through the Suez Canal. So what's happened to international shipping? Which costs them lots of money. It's another month to go all the way around Africa. So that's adding to the price of goods and services wherever you go. And then there's a little problem with the Panama Canal too. What's the problem with the Panama Canal? There's a drought. And in order to get all the way through the locks and come back out the other side, you have to have fresh water at the top of it so it spills down into the regions below, but there isn't enough fresh water to make it happen. So big ships that are coming through Panama have to unload half their cargo to go through. So what are you going to do? I mean, it's just a mess internationally, and nobody's really aware of what's going on except for those who are really watching. So the Houthis are part of Yemen, and they're being supplied by Iran.
So far, all of the missiles and drones that the Houthis have fired towards Eilat have been either intercepted by American or Israeli warships operating within the Red Sea, intercepted by Israeli or Saudi anti-air defenses, or have crashed off target without causing any casualties. But the Houthis are only likely to continue firing more and more the longer that the war in Gaza continues. But the Houthis are beginning to escalate their side of the war much further in other ways too. On the 19th of November, a cargo ship called the Galaxy Leader that was traveling through the Red Sea on its way to India was spectacularly hijacked by a group of armed and well-trained Houthi militants, who raided the ship with a helicopter and then brought it, along with the ship's entire crew, back to one of their own controlled ports in Yemen as hostages. This hijacking took place shortly after the Houthi spokesperson declared that their intention going forward will be to target any ship owned or operated by Israeli companies or flying the Israeli flag that they catch traveling in the Red Sea or through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Galaxy Leader ship that they hijacked on November 19th wasn't crewed by any Israelis, but apparently did have some ownership ties to an Israeli business tycoon. Going forward, the Houthis are likely to continue targeting Israel's ability to conduct trade with Asia through the Suez Canal by attempting further maritime piracy and hijackings around the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait that they control most of the eastern shore of, and by continuing to fire missiles and drones at the southern Israeli port of Eilat. From the Houthis' perspective, the aim of these attacks will be to restrict Israel's maritime trade in the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal as much as possible, and limit Israel's ability to conduct maritime trade to only their west coast on the shores of the Mediterranean. And while Israel hasn't retaliated against the Houthis yet, it might be forced to if the war in Gaza continues dragging on and the Houthi attacks on them continue escalating.
So who else is sitting in the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, and in that part of the Indian Ocean to deal with the Houthis? United States? Who said it? France? Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. I mean, it's like almost everybody. And this is why people have a navy, is to protect your international commerce. Do you all know about what Jefferson did when he was president? Just to give you an example. Yeah.
Mistaken when Jefferson, before Jefferson, there was a history of a bunch of pirates who were taking supplies out here around Africa and also the east.
Yep.
And they had been paying these people off for Washington up to Jefferson, and Jefferson was like, all right, no, we can't do this. We actually need to come up with a feasible option to help prevent this. And that feasible option was every couple of years we determine whether or not we're going to send money into our military and navy so that we now have fleets of ships and fleets of men available to fight and protect the United States. Point of interest, and that's why
Yep.
for as many years we have a re-election of how many funds are going into that.
Right.
We have a traditional standing army.
So it was the Barbary pirates of North Africa, and when they captured another ship, they turned the entire crew into slaves, sold them in North Africa, confiscated all their goods. So Jefferson built 6 frigates to attack the Barbary pirates, and that's where we get to the shores of Tripoli in the song. He sent the Constitution, the Congress, Independence. There's Constitution in Boston, and there's another one in Baltimore that are still alive. But that was to protect international commerce, and that's why we still do it today. Yes, Jessica.
This question is a little off topic, so if you want to address
Yeah.
it later, that's fine. I've been hearing a lot about oil lately. And
About who?
oil.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, my Arkansas. And that it, the theory is that Israel is after oil that's offshore in Gaza that's more accessible than some of their other oil. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
It is true. I know Zion Oil and what's the other one? Something oil and gas. They're offshore supplies of, it's mainly natural gas. It's not a whole lot of oil, but there is a lot of natural gas to be had, are in these offshore oil rigs. And so to the north and south, they've been accused by Syria and by Egypt and others of, being beyond their reach. Meanwhile, Russia builds rigs all over the poles and nobody cares because they can't really stop them. But that is true. There's, I think, a natural gas supply out there. Yes, Jesse?
Don't underestimate the importance of the boat in the whole conflict. So it's like a part of our sovereign heritage, floating wherever it goes. And the biggest example I can give you is Pearl Harbor. You can go back through history and these conversations start with boats.
Yeah, they do. And that's what Japan was hoping to do during World War II, was a 1-2 punch and take out the United States from entering into a war in the Pacific. And they said, well, they got their whole fleet just sitting there, we can bomb it and get rid of it. The problem is they didn't know how dedicated America was to refurbishing those ships. And a couple did get out of the harbor, but the big opportunity missed there was Japan didn't strike all the oil reserves in Hawaii. If they had, they would have gotten us out of the war for a while. So the Houthi thing is really bad. And it is going to affect Israel as well as many other countries, and that might be another way that it applies pressure. Do we have any other comments? So we'll keep on pressing.
Meanwhile, officials in the United States are already mulling about what to do about the fate of the hostages taken by the Houthis, and what to do if Houthi piracy in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden continues further. The prospect of the Houthis running amok with piracy in the region right now is a terrifying prospect for Washington to consider, because it stands to jeopardize their much-lauded India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. A proposal that was announced by the governments of the United States, India, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and the European Union back in September of 2023 during the G20 summit, only a month before Hamas's attack on Israel happened. The plan, as it was originally envisioned, was to construct more shipping and rail networks between the loosely aligned governments of India, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and the European Union, a goal that would greatly benefit the United States.
I can't resist not telling you about that. So the Suez Canal was built by the British and the French in the 1850s, I believe, 1860s, right before our Civil War. What's interesting is that it's always been kind of a bottleneck. It's never been the best solution. And I always thought I woke up in the middle of the night one night, I'm like, why not build a canal through Israel? It's perfect. All they have to do is go over to the Jordan, down through the Dead Sea, out to the Gulf of Aqaba. And you'd have a beautiful little canal that took you to the other side, not to the Red Sea, but to the, what is that other one? Where the Ararat is, the port. It would take you right out through their port. And I looked it up. There was a secret deal between the United States, CIA, and Israel to open that canal. If you can look it up on Google, it is absolutely amazing, because they wanted to bypass having to deal with any more Arabs in the Middle East, and also for economic reasons. And I would love it if that came back to fruition. If Israel did that, what a mess they would have from their Arab neighbors. But if you look it up on Google, I think it was 1963 that was proposed.
As well, because it would also happen to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative ambitions in the region. And, more importantly, it would directly counter Russia's proposed north-south transport corridor between themselves, Azerbaijan, Iran, and India. Washington would rather keep India within their economic orbit than Iran's and Russia's. But with the war erupting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the strained relations that it's caused between Israel and the Saudis, Jordanians, and Emiratis, the fear of escalation in the West Bank and elsewhere, and the specter of continued Houthi piracy in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and continued missile attacks on Israel, the future of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor is now uncertain. And in order to defend it, the US Navy will be likely to come down hard on Houthi piracy in the region in the future. The former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, James Stavridis, even further suggested on the 22nd of November that it be made painfully clear to Iran that if they continue supporting Houthi piracy in the region, American maritime operations could equally threaten Iran's own critical offshore oil and gas platforms that are in the Persian Gulf and their own shipping lanes through the narrow Strait of Hormuz. And hence, why one of the American carrier strike groups has relocated from the eastern Mediterranean near Israel to move immediately adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz off Iran's southern coast. The Houthis made a move on the board. The United States responded with a move on their own, and more may follow. Moving to the north, there is Iran's bishop, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. The Syrian government is the most militantly opposed to Israel's existence that remains in the Arab world, and they've continually remained officially at war with Israel ever since Israel's declaration of independence back in 1948. Their armies have clashed multiple times all throughout history, and ever since 1967, Israel has occupied the strategic plateau of the Golan Heights, a geographic area of high ground looking directly into the lower elevated areas of northern Israel proper, that most of the world recognizes as Israeli-occupied territory of Syria. Syria has continued to maintain its own claim to the Golan Heights ever since they lost it in 1967. But despite that, and despite their continued official state of war with Israel, the Assad regime in Syria is in no possible place to do anything against Israel right now during the war in Gaza, because of their own continuing brutal civil war. Ever since 2012, when the fires of all-out civil war first erupted in Syria, more than 600,000 people in the country have been killed, while more than 6.5 million more people have fled the country, likely making it the single deadliest war ever fought entirely in the 21st century.
And most of those people are now refugees in Europe. So let's stop there, and we'll pick up with Syria next time. But it's just important to know what's going on with each of these countries so you can understand when you read the news, you can interpret it and understand, okay, this is why this is happening. But it's all leading up to Obadiah 1. The big fight of the proximal states would be Psalms 83, and the Y is the man coming up from Basra with dyed garments from Isaiah 63. And then, of course, you've got Joel 3. So we'll pick up next week, but thank you for your time.